Good evening, boys and girls. I have a rather sober announcement tonight. A certain Donald Wills of Media Freak Reviews dares make the claim that Pepsi is not the drink of unboxing champions. He dares says that it is Coke, but no, alas, he is mistaken. In fact, it is heretical to say so. I shall unleash holy war upon thee. I'm just kidding. But yeah, very flattered. Good friend of mine, Donald Wills, to whom I sent some things, some Blu-rays. He gave me a shout out and he kind of parodied my Drink of Unboxing Champions thing with Coke, and so just wanted to give him a little shout out before we begin the video. I'll put a link to his channel in the description, so please check him out. And yeah, very appreciative of the, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, as they say. But Pepsi still is the drink of unboxing champions. Anyway, so the topic for tonight's video that I am recording while I cannot sleep is horror comedies. Now, what exactly defines a horror comedy, you may ask? Well, that can often be a rather difficult thing to discern because there are many horror films that we love to laugh at, but, the people who were making them really meant everything that they were filming. They weren't making something with the intention to be funny. They were making something that they really believed in. It was their failure to do so that makes the film so endearing to us, such as Troll 2, and this one has Troll 1 in here as well. This is the Eureka version of it, from the UK. I like this better than the Scream Factory one, as you know, Troll 1 has nothing to do with Troll 2 whatsoever. But the people making Troll 2, they really thought that they were making something great. And their ineptitude, is what made for such an entertaining film. But so we're not going to cover films like that or something like The Fanatic, where they're really trying, but it's just their inability to get to where they want to go is what makes it funny. We're not going to talk about that. We are instead going to talk about films that, to whatever extent, are trying to elicit some kind of laugh, and usually from a more perverse place, hence the horror part of the horror comedy designation. And, they need to be at least somewhat aware of exactly what they're doing and why. And, so they have different parts comedy, different parts horror, and it's usually some kind of unique fusion of the bunch. And I just realized one that I forgot right here, which, I just showed it to you, so might as well get it out of the way. This is a good contemporary example of Jennifer's Body here, where you had a horror premise of a teenage girl getting used in a demonic sacrifice, and her body becomes home to a demon. And this already kind of sexually, I don't know if provocative is the right word, but sexually confident, sexually powerful person. This this entity gets inside of her and exacerbates that many, many times over. Not to mention the fact that, she, just her worst kind of aspects get amplified many, many times over. And what makes it so great is that you got Diablo Cody on the script, and her ability to write really killer dialogue is so on point in this film. And thankfully now it's getting the retrospective appraisal that it should have gotten at the time. And I still think it's just criminal that it wasn't as well received at the time as it is becoming, because I liked it when no one else did. So I'm very pleased to say I was ahead of the game on that one. But at any rate, this is actually a good intro to the subject of horror comedy, because it's still a horror film in terms of the gore and the scares and the kind of dark themes, but it also has some really witty dialogue, as Diablo Cody tends to do. and it's got, moments that have a good amount of comedy in them, as well as horror elements too. Um, and then, I mean, that was like a relatively mainstream film, big stars, and it was through Fox Atomic, I want to say, which was it's a now defunct subgenre label for 20th Century Fox, which of course now 20th Century Fox has been assimilated by Disney, just like everything. It's like the Borg, pretty much. Um, but at any rate, that was an example of how that sort of thing could come out in the mainstream. It wasn't quite as indie or off the beaten track as or cult as a lot of horror comedies tend to be as they age. But we're gonna look at some that are a little less mainstream now. Some that are really mainstream that I do need to mention that I tragically do not have in the collection yet are the Scream films, which I love, but during that great purging, I had to sell a lot of stuff, and I do want to get them back. I'm just kind of hoping that they do like 4K releases, or Scream Factory can get a hold of them or something. I think that'd be awesome. Arrow, I don't know what. Now, granted, the right situation. I mean, from what I understand, everything that the Weinsteins touched in Miramax and in the Weinstein Company, all those assets were bought by, I think it was Lantern Capital, not too long ago in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein fall from grace, and so I think that part of the fact that those are out of print, part of the reason why is because I'm sure that they're trying to get all their various assets organized so that way they can put them out, but under whatever label they're going to put it out under. I really don't know, but the I think a lot of those rights are getting sorted out. But I do love the Scream films, but I can't really talk about them in depth because I don't have them physically here. But definitely watch them, and I'm sure you probably have already. But and then the other obvious one is Shaun of the Dead, which I'm waiting for that Edgar Wright trilogy 4K pack to. Waiting for a good price on that. That's what's been holding me back. But it's still a great horror comedy. Um, but we are going to talk about some of the ones that I do have in front of me. Um, one of the ones, one of the series that, is it horror comedy like all the way through? Not really, but it does deserve a mention, which is actually the Evil Dead series. Which what's funny is that actually in this film, Jennifer Megan Fox, she has an Evil Dead T-shirt that she got from Amanda Seyfried's character Needy, which is kind of a cool homage. And it was the first. This is the very first Evil Dead, which is not a horror comedy. In fact, it's quite an intense horror film. Really, just nasty and brutal and low budget, but making really good use out of its low budget. Going where most horror films would never dare to go. And but yeah, not a horror comedy. Even though this series is very well known for some of the campier later sequels, this one is just a straightforward, intense horror film, as was the 2013 remake, both cuts of it. Yeah, the 2013 remake was not a horror comedy. It was just a straight up, really, really gory, disturbing, horror film. So you kind of have to take those out right off the bat. And then you have Evil Dead 2, which more formally introduces the horror comedy elements, where there's. And they straddle the line pretty well because of it's not too comedic, but it's not too, it has just that right amount. Or even when something funny happens, it is kind of perverse, or it's like, Ash has to cut off his own hand, with the chainsaw because it gets possessed. And then his disembodied hand is like crawling along the floor and it like flips him the bird, and things like that. So it's like, there's enough self awareness there to definitely say that it has horror comedy in it, but it also doesn't skimp on the disturbing aspects, the horrific aspects of the story, because like probably the best example of that is so they do the what I call the steady cam of death, and I think that there was I think there was a more official name for it, but it was what was pioneered in the first one. And what they actually do here is they had, you had Bruce Campbell. Sorry, why did I say Bruce Lee? Bruce Campbell. He had like this apparatus where they could like, turn him all around and, make him fly through the trees and stuff. I mean, it was pretty innovative camera work. Plus, like the Steadicam of Death like follows him through the house, and it's like the way it's done is like you can't help but laugh, as well as like the scene that best exemplifies it is when Ash is because all the supernatural stuff, it all just comes flying at him, and never lets up. There's never a break, pretty much. And the part where he's just really starting to lose it is where all the various inanimate objects in the cabin, where they're all laughing at him, and you got like that deadite deer's head or moose head or whatever it was. I think it was deer head that turns, laughs, and then everything in the house laughs, and then he just turns to the camera and has that like really cross-eyed, like bizarre, manic, horrific laugh, and it's like he's just losing it, and it's like that's kind of that in and of itself kind of sums up the movie, plus just how over the top the blood is and how much of it there is and everything. So it's like, if you want like a film that really blends the two together very, very well, then Evil Dead 2 is probably the best example of that. And then once you get to Army of Darkness, I would say that this one is by far the most overtly comedic out of all of them. Arguably the most entertaining, although I think they're all great for what they are. But yeah, this one definitely focuses more on the comedy than on the horror. If anything, you could call it more dark fantasy than even straight out horror. But it's great for what it is. And yeah, again, arguably the most enjoyable of the original three films. But it also does kind of stand out on its own, because the rights to this film are intertwined with Universal still. And so, like, the rights for these movies are all over the place, because, like, Lionsgate put out these two releases for Evil Dead 1 and 2. And if you actually check the releases, beyond just who put it out on home video, if you actually check out the releases of them, then it gets even more complicated. And then you got Universal for Army of Darkness, which they still have. And then you got Sony, specifically TriStar, for the remake. And then and I think partially is because Ghost House Pictures had, I don't know if they still do, but a Sony deal. And then Ash vs. Evil Dead here was on Starz, and it's put out by, Anchor Bay for the first two seasons, and then Lionsgate for the last one. So it's just all over the place. And then you factor in this series, which I admittedly haven't finished yet, but it's one of those things where, yeah, there is a horror comedy tone to it, but it's like, well, what percentage do you call it? And also the fact that I guess because of the rights situation with Army of Darkness, it kind of picks up, it mostly picks up in the wake of Evil Dead 2, and so Army of Darkness is kind of just off on its own. But yeah, it's just, there's so many different ways to slice this particular series, but I think that's part of why people love it so much, because it endures, and it kind of different movies or shows, different ones, they can satisfy whatever kind of mood you're in for whatever kind of horror you want. Do you want something that's more intense? Do you want something that's kind of in between? Or do you want something that's really, really funny and kind of over the top? So they definitely hit on all those different levels, which, if we're talking about funny and over the top, got to touch on some trauma here. And, I want to do a whole dedicated video to trauma because of how amazing their output is, and how great, Lloyd has been for independent cinema. But, just to give you a little, because, like, trauma films, are they horror comedies? Much of the time, but not always. And even if they are horror comedies, they've got aspects of, like, say, The Toxic Avenger here, the Japanese cut of The Toxic Avenger. It's a superhero film. It's horror. It's comedy. It's got romance. It's got all these different things in it, and it all blends together in such a way that only Lloyd Kaufman could do. And it's such that it trauma films, especially the Lloyd Kaufman ones, they're such that they really just kind of become their own genres. I mean, that's the best way I can say it because of the fusion of all these things, and they all come together in a way that only someone like Lloyd Kaufman can do. I mean, in a way, I think that's kind of the ultimate compliment because all you have to do is say it's a trauma film, and people more or less know what that is. But yeah, I mean, it's not always this way because, like, for example, the original Class of Newcom High film, and the sequels, like the first two sequels. Yeah, they were horror comedies technically, but they also had sci-fi. They also had societal, social commentary. So you had a little bit of satire, which I mean, satire and comedy definitely go together, but they're not necessarily the same. Um, but it's like the comedy seems to come more from the cheesiness of the effects rather than necessarily specific jokes, but that's a matter of opinion, as opposed to, say, Return to Newcomb High Volumes 1 and 2, which are more overtly satirical, more overtly horror comedies, but again, also romances and, horror and all this stuff. I mean, I think that this, to me, it feels more overtly comedic than horrific, but I mean, I think that is partially, because Lloyd is primarily, I kind of like to describe his style as basically being like Mel Brooks on acid, like that's mixed with some early George Romero, I think that that's a good descriptor, but yeah, definitely funny, definitely good satire in these films, and I think these are the best of the Newcomb High series. Um, and then, of course, which I mentioned, our dear Donald in the Donald Wills in the beginning of this thing, and I sent him the DVD of Poultrygeist. I have the Blu-ray, signed by Lloyd Kaufman, and this was one of not the very first one, but one of the first trauma films I saw. It's a good entree to trauma, I think, because now it's very intense in terms of the gore and the over the topness of it, but also I think the satire is on point. It's one of the ones I've seen the most amount of times, because it was definitely of its time relative to all the various nonsense that was going on during the Bush years, and this really encapsulates it very well. Um, but it also the intent was to make it the goriest film ever made, and I don't know if they necessarily succeeded because I mean, even if they did, it's like, well, someone's gonna come along and beat that tomorrow. But still, it's one of my favorite trauma films. It's a zombie film. It's a satire of the fast food industry. It's got romance. It's got musical numbers. It's like, what doesn't this thing have? Pretty much. Um, it's definitely a good idea of what you're in for when you're talking about trauma. And all you got to do is say Poultrygeist, and it's like, well, you got it. And then this one is not one that Lloyd directed, but it's still worth a mention. It was B.C. Butcher that Kansas Bowling directed. And Kansas Bowling, you may know, there she is. You may know. Oh, so you see, actually, I got Lloyd's signature and I got Kansas Bowling's signature. And, the she was trying to draw some, like, slug thing on the inside. Um, and you may know her from as being one of the Manson family girls in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because Tarantino's a big trauma fan, and he must have seen this film and was like, hey, why not be in the movie? And also, I mean, I know that Kansas Bowling herself is big into Charles Manson and kind of fancied herself like a Manson girl in a way. I mean, I remembered meeting her at Dragon Con, and I was like, she's a very, like, sweet kind of demure kind of person, it seems, but then she also will, like, throw you a curveball where, like, she was gonna write, like, Hail Satan on the inside of this thing, and I was just like, what? It was seriously the last thing I expected, and it was one of the strangest things I'd ever heard at the time, from an unexpected source. But anyway, it was this is a caveman, it's a caveman slasher slash comedy slash. Someone on the front here said cave girl gangs, rock and roll cannibalism, and Kato Kalin from the O.J. Simpson trial, and it's as if Russ Meyer directed The Monkees, which I think that kind of sums it up there. Now, it was made when she wrote and directed when she was 16, and so it was definite. That's what caught Lloyd's attention, because she was someone that really showed a lot of tenacity at such an early age, and so she's continuing to ascend in the indie world, and obviously having been in a Best Picture nominated film, and all that good stuff. Speaking of Troma alumni, we have Cabin Fever by Eli Roth. Eli Roth had little bit parts in a few Troma films like Terror Firmer, and then he went off and did his own thing with Cabin Fever, which he'd been trying to get made since like '95, I think, and then it finally came out, 2002. I want to say, 2002, and this film, it definitely it shows its grindhouse roots. It's very much in the vein of something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre in terms of the kind of tone it goes for. I think it's a little bit more perhaps overtly campy and comedic compared to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but nonetheless, you can see the grindhouse roots of it. You can see some aspects of certain kinds of teen comedies, but a lot of exploitation films from the 70s, a lot of just kind of rough indie horror films from that era that went into this. And some critics were saying that the film kind of had a hard time deciding what it wanted to do in terms of tone. You could make that argument. I mean, I think that it was what it was, which was basically just kind of a B-movie grindhouse throwback that had, horror comedy elements, and in a way it's kind of almost coming off the heels of the late 90s gross out teen comedy, but except that while there are gross out moments in this, it is through a horror lens, and it's through the lens of someone that of Eli Roth, who had actually had a really bad skin infection when he was abroad, and that's what inspired this film, which is all about something in the water that makes people have this horrific condition. So and I like films that are about we're living in the pandemic era, the corona era right now, or the corona age I called it. We're living in that time in history right now, but there have been all kinds of other pandemics and other bad things in the water, or different things, like if you're traveling to you go someplace that's really, really hot and wet, like the Amazon or something, and it's who knows just how many different species of insects are down there that are carrying God knows what, that's some kind of really horrific, debilitating disease that people probably haven't even discovered yet. It's the possibilities are endless, and if you're a germaphobe, it's there's no shortage of things in this world to freak out about when it comes to diseases. Next up, I didn't want to get the whole series out again, but it was the Sharknado series, which I kind of wondered about this. I mean, I think that there was a certain degree of self-aware cheesiness, especially with the title, and then especially as the series progresses, they get pretty explicitly self-aware. Asylum films can be a little hard to categorize in that way, because it's are they horror comedies just because they're usually pretty low budget and kind of cheesy, or are they horror comedies because they're actually trying to be horror comedies? It's hard to say. It really depends on the movie. I think the first Sharknado, any kind of goofiness that it has is more so in the overall premise, plus the ending with him, Ian Ziering, Yeah, or I don't know if it's Ian Ion. I've heard it different ways, but yeah, it revs up the chainsaw and zzz, buzz saws his way out of there, or chainsaws his way out of there, and it definitely, I think it definitely caught, it caught the world by a storm, and obviously by a by a Sharknado storm. Cult classic is born. Can't believe how much I loved it from Dread Central and has to be seen to be believed. And it's like it really did kind of take the world by storm at the time, and they just embraced their campiness kind of as they went along. But yeah, I think that very first film, it kind of straddles the line between like, is it funny just because the premise is cheesy, or is it funny because they're really trying to be a horror comedy, so it's like I could see it either way. Um, Now, two films that are very much self aware about their cheesiness, and they do overtly try to be horror comedies, and I think very successfully, are Velocipaster and Zombieverse. Velocipaster I saw maybe a couple months ago, and I absolutely loved it. I keep telling everybody this is like one of the funniest movies I've seen in such a long time. You gotta go see it. It's fucking great. I absolutely love it. They know exactly what kind of movie they're making, and they just go for broke. They don't care how stupid the premise is. They don't care how stupid the Velocipaster costume looks. They just go for it, and it's like it's so great because of that. It's like you gotta love just the I love films that go for broke. Whatever it is, if it's comedy, if it's horror, if it's drama, even whatever it is, they just go all the way. And similarly, Zombieverse, which I've shown off before, but it's got one of my favorite lines of dialogue in any horror comedy for sure, if not any horror film, but it just cracks me up every time, which is, "We cannot be fighting amongst ourselves. That is exactly what the beavers would want." Oh, how can you not love that? I mean, that's, as soon as I heard that, I was like, I love this movie now. Um, and then I only got a few left. Return of the Living Dead. Only really, the first and the second one really can be called horror comedies. I think the first one really succeeds at that because it is more self aware, it's more clever. The second one really is just a bad imitation of the first one. But the first one really is very. It's a unique, kind of refreshing zombie film relative to the time because of how much it does differently from the Romero zombies, and then how, like, let's say 28 Days Later or whatever, how those zombies are totally different from either this or the Romero zombies. So it's like it's good that they're able to kind of carve out a unique identity for their zombies, but yeah, this really does strike that horror comedy tone very, very well. Um, and I'm sure most people have seen this, but if you haven't, then you gotta go check it out. And then finally, we get to two that these ones definitely fit into the dark comedy slash satire, subgenre of comedy. And as far as horror, I think the elements, they're definitely there, but they're a little bit more understated, or they're more wrapped in that satire and that dark comedy, which is Vampire's Kiss and American Psycho, which I have already talked about as well. But they both are primarily satires and also character studies of their incredibly egomaniacal, self-obsessed 80s Wall Street protagonists, and one of which was made in 88 and the other one was 2000, but nonetheless, they would make a great double feature because the characters are very similar. They both are kind of losing their heads, they're losing their minds, they're kind of being consumed by their own self-obsessions and the shallowness of the societies in which they find themselves. And Nicolas Cage's character Peter Lowe believes that he's becoming a vampire. And then American Psycho here, it's up in the air as to whether or not Patrick Bateman actually is a serial killer, or if he's just someone who has a lot of really disturbed thoughts. I mean, the novel, again, it blurs those lines pretty extensively, but also, if you read the novel through the lens of, because I guess it was Bret Easton Ellis who, after having written it, he's just said that he had to get rid of all the feelings that were inside of him because he was surrounded by the kinds of shallow people that Patrick Bateman's surrounded by, people with whom he doesn't relate and clearly despises, and yet he's trying so hard to fit in. And it's like, well, why? And he clearly, again, it's an interesting psychological study, but it's more so the kind of sociopathic humor in here that really makes it come alive. And like, I remember my friends and I in college would quote the film all the time. It's a very quotable film, and I know that Christian Bale, he based his performance very heavily on not just Tom Cruise, but also on Nicolas Cage's performance in Vampire's Kiss, and it makes total sense because they are similar characters. Nicolas Cage definitely goes more overtly over the top with it. Now, granted, Patrick Bateman has his over the top moments for sure, but Nicolas Cage, I think, because he's Nicolas Cage, he just goes for it, and he really, he really puts on a show. Like, it's up there with like Jim Carrey and Liar Liar, like that kind of delivery, and I love Liar Liar, so this has got to be one of the funniest movies I've ever seen in my life, and especially if you have a really kind of dark, fucked up sense of humor, then it'll definitely tickle your funny bones. Same with American Psycho, which that is a little bit more satirical and less like perhaps overtly comedic, although it definitely has its iconic lines. Um, but yeah, I mean, they both they do their thing and they do it very well, and especially when you look at it through that satirical lens, I think that's where you get the full effect of these people that are surrounded by shallowness. They surround themselves with shallowness, but they don't, on some subconscious level, they want to be, loved and accepted for who they are. They want to have meaningful connections with people, but they can't because the lives that they've chosen preclude them from doing that. There's all kind of different layers of meaning, but on top of that, you've just got so many iconic lines and moments that are just hilarious. And for horror comedies, it's like there are so many, some of which are good, some of which are bad, some of which are forgettable. And it's like, well, those are some of the ones that I happen to have, but the list is so long. It's just like it could go on and on. And again, it's like, well, what do you even call it? Because like a lot of the funniest ones are the ones where they were really trying, and them not getting there is what makes it funny. So it really depends. But nonetheless, those are some that stuck out to me that I happen to have in my collection. But yeah, please, if you like this, then please like, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon. Set phasers to stun, warp factor 5. Please check out Donald Wills and his channel Media Freak Reviews. Pepsi is the drink of unboxing champions. Thank you very much. And I will sit here and polish this bad boy off while I see you in the next video. Hopefully some of the things I ordered will come in the mail, and we can have a good old unboxing time. So, good night, everyone.